Maybe we should begin with the the question of dialogue. I remember that you told me you were very close to Rimando Panica. Actually, we did interview a dialogue before the Parliament of Religion in Barcelona. So you were cousins, I guess. Was very much impressed by the distinction that he made between dialectic dialogue and a dialogical dialogue. And he envisioned the new mode of human interaction should be understood in the dialogical terms. I understand you also published a book on the dialogue among civilizations in 2002.
Yes.
So your take on dialogue is very important for me.
Well, this is an idea which has gained increasing prominence in recent times during the last 50 years or so, because it's an effort to rethink the character of human relationships. Not just as two egos meeting separately, but really encountering each other without dominating, without converging, respecting each other in the integrity of each person, but coming together through dialogical interaction, coming to understand what the other person is trying to say, what the other person represents, and then to accept this and to learn from that other person and to respond in such a way that the other person can reciprocate in this way. So that's, I think, it's a development which is very crucial in many parts of the world, but especially in the Western world, where we had for a very long time forgotten about this kind of interaction, dialogical interaction. Because, as you say, we were dominated to a very large extent by either dialectic or pure logic, the logic of non-contradiction. So that there are two elements, they cannot meet together because they contradict each other. And then there's the dialectical relationship, which is basically a relationship of opposition and overcoming the opposition through some form of dialectic. That's the Hegelian position. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So that's one way of dealing with oppositions, but it is not yet the kind of method which we require for true encounter, for true mutual understanding. So in lieu of dialectic, we are coming to this idea of dialogue.
Yes.
And some of the main thinkers of dialogue in the 20th century were people like Martin Buber.
Yes.
Of course, very important.
I-thou relationship.
I-thou relationship. But then, very importantly, the philosopher Gadamer, Hans-Georg Gadamer. And he had a great influence on my own thinking. Over the years, I became very close to his work, his writings, and have commented on many places about his writings. And we developed a kind of a very friendly relationship. And I came to understand really the importance of dialogue, which in German is called Gespräch. And for Gadamer, the basic idea was Gespräch. We are constantly in Gespräch. We are constantly in a dialogue. We are in dialogue with ourselves. In order to understand ourselves, I have to also ask myself questions, and I respond to these questions. So I am in dialogue with myself. I am in dialogue with other people in my family and my friends. I dialogue with them. But we are also dialoguing with texts, with literature. So for Gadamer, the reading of a text was to enter into a dialogue with the text. If, for instance, I want to understand a dialogue, a text by Plato, if I want to understand a text by Plato, I come to Plato and I ask a question. Ask, what do you mean? What does that text mean? And so the text responds in a certain way by giving me some sentences, but I may not fully understand these sentences. I come to this text from my own background, from my own frame of reference, and the text may not completely correspond to my frame of reference. So I have to ask questions, and the text responds to my questions, and I have to open up my frame of reference in a broader way, and thereby come closer to the meaning of the text. So it's a search for meaning of text. Could also be a poem, could be literature, could be music, that through question and answer, I open myself to the meaning of what is presented to me. But Gadamer extended it further, and what particularly excited me was that he extended it to intercultural dialogue, intercultural relationship. So I think Gadamer was one of the few truly dialogical philosophers who were also cosmopolitan or global dialogue, intercultural dialogue. I talked with him many times also about India, about Asia, and he was very much interested in that. He was very much opposed to a monological kind of system which exists in the world when a dominant power, dictates the frame of reference. Mm-hmm. A dominant power dictates the discourse in the world. Mm-hmm. So he was very much opposed to imperialism, mm-hmm. to unilateral domination, and for him the basic idea was to overcome monologue through dialogue, the dialogical engagement between cultures, between religions, between traditions, so as to overcome this unilateralism, which is basically an egocentrism or mm-hmm. ethnocentrism. That was really what he opposed: ethnocentrism, egocentrism, all these things. Open oneself up. I found this was just absolutely crucial in our situation in the Western world, because to a very large extent, the Western world has become or has been a domineering culture, try to dominate everything in the world unilaterally, without listening, without engaging the other truly in dialogue. And that has been, I think, the curse of Western civilization. Now, there are many good things about Western civilization, but the curse of Western civilization was this impulse to dominate other cultures, to dominate other religions. That came to be known under the label of Orientalism, that mm-hmm. we Orientalize the others, we treat them as an object for our benefit. But it also, the same kind of domineering impulse is from our culture versus nature, that we try to dominate nature and control nature and exploit nature for our own benefit. So that's a form of control which is very destructive. So this tendency to dominate others, other cultures, we have to overcome through dialogue, but also the tendency to dominate nature, which is deeply rooted in modern Western civilization, deeply rooted in the whole tradition which comes from the late Middle Ages, from Francis Bacon and Newton and Descartes, the Cartesian idea of the ego standing over against the other world, the outer world. There's the inner ego, and the other world is out there. And what the ego is supposed to do is to dominate this outer world. Now that is the seed of unilateral domination, and we see the effects of this in modern technology, in the modern exploitation of nature, which may lead really to natural disaster because the resources are not renewable, and this whole process is not sustainable in the long run. So here, there too, the idea of dialogue comes in. Instead of dominating nature, we need to enter into a dialogue with nature, listen to nature. What is nature telling us? Now, I mean, we say, well, we cannot talk to nature, but nature does speak to us, not perhaps in a human voice, but nature speaks to us in certain events, in certain phenomena, which we discover and which are triggered by our form of exploitation of nature. So nature responds by certain catastrophes, by tsunamis, by things which are overwhelming, natural catastrophes. Well, nature telling us something. They dialogue with us, and we have to respond to these natural catastrophes. So anyway, there's this dialogue in many, many directions, and the ultimate dialogue for Gadamer and for me also is the dialogue with sometimes called the divine, or the heaven perhaps in Chinese. So these different dimensions of dialogue to overcome unilateralism, you know, and to become really part of a cosmos. That's how I see it. The whole
That's great.
So
yeah, my sense is that the dialogical mode is predicated on the aspiration that human community, I call it as a kind of fiduciary community, and will be able to cultivate a kind of a dialogical civilization. So that dialogue among civilizations is absolutely necessary for the cultivation of the culture of peace. Now, many people are very suspicious that whether dialogue is possible between two people who are not on the equal, equal basis. And that, for example, the series of so-called dialogues between United States and China, and on trade, on the evaluation of renminbi, on even military strategy, strictly speaking, none of them are dialogue. It's a bargain, exerting pressure, using strategy to maximize one's own profit. So normally the dialogical mode, even with Martin Buber, the Iron Tao, is between two like-minded people committed to the quest for a common, common way of human flourishing. So people are very suspicious whether in the 21st century, with all these conflicts and tensions, globalization actually leads to regionalization and localization, whether Panika's notion about the dialogical dialogue is realizable. And I don't know whether a kind of optimism is required in order to appreciate it, or it is so crucial for the human community that it's an art that needs to be cultivated.
Well, I fully agree with you, and I did not mention previously the name that you now introduced into our discussion, the name of Raymond Panikar. I refer mainly to Buber and to Gadamer. Now, Panikar introduces a very important dimension of dialogue, namely a dimension across cultures and across different language games, different idioms. And Panikar was deeply rooted both in the Western philosophy, but also in the Indian philosophical tradition. And in the Indian philosophical tradition, he found a very congenial kind of medium of expressing himself in a tradition which is called Vedanta, the Advaita Vedanta, the non-dualistic Vedanta, which completely opposes the Cartesian bifurcation of mind and body, inner and outer, mind, matter, all these things. So Vedanta is precisely the opposite of Cartesianism, say. And Panikar developed this very well in this idea of Advaita, of non-dualism, that we are all involved in a cosmic unity, which cannot be split apart into separate elements. Now, what you're saying is you're referring to the difficulties involved in all forms of dialogue. There are many skeptical arguments regarding dialogue. One skeptical argument is this, that dialogue is simply impossible if people do not speak precisely the same language and do not come from the same background. So the argument there is basically an incompatibility between different perspectives, between different languages, and you cannot translate. You cannot dialogue between them. That is frequently called incommensurability. Language games are incommensurable with each other, so you cannot possibly dialogue. Well, I think this is an important point, but it has been proven to be wrong, because to a very large extent it is possible to translate between language games. We have shown it through translations, which are never perfect, but at least some of the essence of a statement, of a perspective, of a tradition can be translated approximately and made clear to other people. So the incommensurability thesis is there, which can be refuted, which can be overcome. And then there is the point that you mentioned, that how can there be dialogue among people who are not really on the same level? In other words, if there's a basic inequality between the participants, that's a frequent objection made. And people, especially those who claim to be realistic, and not utopian, but realistic, they say, well, there's no such thing about like dialogue, because there are always inequalities, and the stronger always dominates the weaker. So that is an argument, which political realists, so-called, always make. But the point is this: there are certain preconditions of dialogue. And so if we want to have real or genuine dialogue, we have to work at removing the inequalities which would prevent a genuine dialogue. So the first precondition is that we establish a certain commonality between the participants of a dialogue, a rough equality, not an absolute or numerical equality, but a rough equality, so that neither party feels superior or inferior. Because if one party feels inferior, it immediately feels like dominated or exploited. And so there is an important aspect of trying to establish an equality between the participants. And if you can do this, then you have at least one precondition fulfilled for dialogue. There is a second precondition which I would also emphasize, and this is that all the parties of a dialogue have to have goodwill to dialogue. If there's no goodwill to dialogue, then you talk to a wall. You cannot advance in your dialogue. So for this reason, we have to cultivate goodwill, the goodwill to dialogue. That was a very important point that Gadamer made always. There is an ethical foundation to dialogue. Dialogue does not just happen. You have to have ethical precondition. And this ethical precondition is one of goodwill, that I'm willing to learn from you. I'm willing to engage with you. Of course, there are some people who are stubborn, who don't want to engage, who have no goodwill. So the problem is, how can we overcome bad will or the absence of goodwill? So all of that means dialogue is not easy. Dialogue is not easy. There's the problem of incommensurability. Not everything can be translated. There is the problem of inequality. And there's the problem of goodwill to dialogue. There was the famous exchange between Gadamer and Derrida, where Derrida opposed this idea of dialogue because he said there is no such thing as goodwill. He said that is too Kantian an idea, or you know. So anyway, Gadamer always insisted that any genuine dialogue requires ethical foundations, and that leads me to think, you know, that something like virtue ethics is really a requirement for dialogue. I mean, you cannot have dialogue without virtues. And that, as you know, that leads me to a certain sympathy toward Confucianism, Confucian virtue ethics. I think Confucianism precisely is also a very good basis for a dialogical dialogue. You know, so that's, I think, where we sort of meet in that domain.
I think the one way of looking at the Confucian tradition is certain form of openness, but it's not universal or abstract universalism. Certainly, it's not a closed particularism, and this openness presupposes pluralism. Now the question is, there are normally the exclusive approach or the inclusive approach, and neither one is particularly satisfactory. The exclusive approach, in fact, is a form of closed particularism, which sometimes it's even aggressive. Not only self-imposed isolation, but aggressive or hostile towards the other often misconceived as the enemy. Whereas the kind of abstract universalism, which is in search of the lowest common denominator in any kind of encounter. And so when you get to the thinnest the area, then the richness of concrete persons would be lost. So the kind of dialogue that is necessary is not only reciprocal, but presupposes, I think, perhaps the most fundamental ethical principle is reciprocity, which is often stated in the negative, the golden rule stated in the negative. Do not do to others what you would not want others to do to you. Now, Hans Kuhn, maybe more than 10 years ago now, and insisted that the golden rule stated in the positive is more or less identical with the golden rule stated in the negative. So the question is, do not do unto others what you would not want others do unto you, as a spirit of reciprocity, in my view, is probably more basic than the assertion that you have to not trying not to do to others what you would not want others to do to you, but do to others what you want others to do to you. I don't know whether have you reflected on this kind of difference, and especially in reference to your notion about conversion.
Yeah, no, I have thought about this, and these different formulations of the golden rule, I mean, to some extent are equivalent, but one can differentiate them in certain ways. I find the negative expression, do not do to others that you do not want them to do to you, I find it quite appealing, but also somewhat limiting because it only insists on the not doing. I not do something to you which you should not be doing to me. But that could be almost like a total withdrawal from a relationship. I don't do anything. So you don't have to do anything for me. I don't do anything for you, you don't do anything for me. That is almost like an abstinence from interaction. This is why the formula, do to others as you want them to do to you, has a more positive dimension. It forces me to be engaged. I have to do something, and I cannot just wait, and not do anything. So it forces me to engage with others, and in the hope that others will reciprocate, will also do to me as the way I did to them. But of course, for me, coming from a Christian background, although in a very ecumenical sense, I cannot forget the instructions which we find in the gospel to go beyond even the golden rule and to walk the extra mile, even beyond what you could expect through reciprocity. As for instance, Jesus, demand that if we are slapped on one cheek, we should offer the other cheek. I mean, that's going beyond pure reciprocity. And the idea that we should be always doing more than what is expected. The extra, going the extra mile. So, I mean, this is a positive ethics which invites us or even requires us to be particularly engaged and do good works without expecting a return, without necessarily having reciprocity. I mean, that is sort of a very pure ethics, which may be perhaps beyond ordinary human expectations, but it's a good, how should I say, utopia, a good goal to aim for. So anyway, I do favor the more positive expression of the golden rule because it requires me to get involved and to do something and to do something good, and there can never be a limit to what is good. And this, I mean, in many human relationships, we find this, that we have to go the extra mile. Take the example of a mother and child.
Yes.
I mean, the mother always does much more than she can expect the child to return. That the child cannot return. That all the goodness which a mother or parent showers upon the child. But the same goes for friendship. If you're really friend to somebody, you want to do much more than what you expect that the friend might do in return. So it's an ethics of giving. Sometimes they call it ethics of giving, and in that respect, Emmanuel Levinas was particularly emphatic on that ethics of the gift without reciprocity. So, but I think the basis of that you made, the argument that there's a golden rule which binds all cultures. I think in all cultures one can find something like the golden rule.
If we want to be more precise, and the golden rule stated in the negative is not just Confucian, it's also Jewish.
Yes.
And I think Rabbi Hillel at one point was asked by one of his students to give a summary of the core of the Talmudic tradition as a whole. He said, do not do to others what you would not want others to do to you. And so there must be a subtle difference. Let's say in a dialogical situation, the positive way certainly is a way of engagement, of maybe even a sense of responsibility toward the other. Let's assume that I've blessed with the good word or the good news, and I'm obligated to share it with others. And if the other, for example, refuses to share, I feel more obligated to engage. Now, if, say, the other turns out to be a Muslim who's committed to a different style of life, different sense of transcendence, almost the clash is inevitable. So we may think about a minimum condition, which is the void, the conflict of conversion. But then you really need to have a positive charge. Otherwise, the minimum condition, as you pointed out, became too passive and not necessarily engaged in the other. So the more positive formulation in the Confucian tradition, comparable to the Golden Rule stated in the positive, states that in order to establish myself, I have to help others to establish themselves.
Beautiful.
In order to enlarge myself, I have to help others to enlarge myself.
That's a beautiful statement.
Yeah. So now that the question of reciprocity is a spirit of tolerance. Tolerance in the sense that the otherness of the other is not perceived as a threat. And not only it's not perceived as a threat, I should welcome it as a positive contribution to my own understanding of the world. So if it is not an occasion for conversion, I have to exercise certain kind of restraint. And even though I feel obligated to spread the good word or the good news. So my sense is that the minimum condition of dialogue is tolerance. And it's related to the idea of reciprocity. But tolerance is a minimum condition, and without recognition of the uniqueness of the other, and with the not only the uniqueness of the other, but also the irreducibility of the other in terms of my encountering, because this even the desire to spread the good news will have to be constrained, because unless I understand what the others want, the sense of engagement dictated by my own sense of responsibility may turn out to be counterproductive. So the respect of the other, the integrity of the other, sometimes in believing something radically different from mine, is necessary for the possibility of mutual referencing and mutual learning, to be sure. So then dialogue is not, we have to avoid even the motivation of conversion in the beginning. Of course, we feel, we're delighted if our own position is being appreciated by the other. But even the hidden desire to convert will have to be somewhat overcome. And nor is it the occasion to try to make a statement about our own faith. This is, of course, an occasion, but if we become too forceful in trying to make a statement, the dialogical atmosphere will be somewhat polluted. And also, it's not even the occasion to try to correct a perceived misunderstanding of my position by the other. So then, you don't convert, you don't make a statement, you don't try to correct some kind of misconception. It seems the dialogue becomes too passive. But I think one great benefit of this kind of attitude towards dialogue is to cultivate the art of listening and to listen to the other. And this listening is not ordinary listening. I think they use the term deep listening, which is not only attentive, but openness and receptivity. And with this, this is something, maybe a virtue to be cultivated. But it is also occasion to broaden our own intellectual horizon. I think Clifford Geertz's notion about confronting radical otherness as a way of liberating ourselves. And before we try to impose our own sense of what is reasonable, what is right, upon the other, in other words, the judgment. And we need to ask ourselves whether our own frame of reference is broad enough. I think Gadamer, of course, is very realistic and wise to make explicit the bias, the limitation in the background of trying to understand something. I think another thing that may turn out to be an extremely beneficial for the dialogical situation is to enhance one's self-awareness, critical self-awareness. And so the other will not only not perceived as a threat, the other may even be considered as a cause for celebration. My own personal experience, I think, is very much a confirmation of that attitude. I consider myself very much of a beneficiary of Christian theology, because some of my esteemed friends, theologians, helped me to understand my own tradition. And one colleague, actually, one of the most respected sinologists, Fritz Mote, was deeply concerned about the implicit Christianization of the Confucian position. When I underscore the importance of religiosity, not Confucianism may not be a religion, but religiosity is very important. And there is a sense of transcendence, even though you can say the form of transcendence is an immanent transcendence. Yeah. But if there's nothing that transcends, it becomes impoverished as a humanism. And so that is the benefit by encountering the various kinds of theological perspectives. And I'm critically aware of the fact, that historically, the particular question of transcendence, especially radical transcendence, never really occurred to the followers of Confucius as a necessary condition for being able to develop an ultimate concern for human flourishing. Because we are in the world, and we have to try to transform the world from within. And even though there's no radical otherness or the holy other, and the divinity or the spirituality works through our own concrete existence. So in that particular situation, the transformation will have to be done through a dialogical encounter with the other. I think the mutual responsiveness of the two dialogical partners is predicated on some kind of self-restraint in the beginning. So my recommendation is that you have to work at the same time two very different, not strategies, two different modes, modes or ways of engagement. One is critically aware of the limitation of my own horizon. I may fail to listen deeply And I may also not, I may not be self-reflexive enough. Yeah, this kind of almost like a form of self-cultivation, and it's not at all in conflict with my sense of responsibility, my sense of positive engagement. But there is a problem of priority. Not priority, there's a problem of the point of departure. I would say the point of departure in a dialogical situation may be better described by the negative formulation, because the danger of imposing something I cherish, and which may reflect a kind of bias, because any religious tradition in this pluralistic context is a concretization of some great values, but at the same time at the expense of others. So with that self-awareness as a precondition, then more positive engagement becomes beneficial. We avoid the danger and then try to underscore the more positive formulation.
Yeah, I follow your argument, and I think on the whole we are together in this whole matter. First of all, as you correctly say, we always approach the other, we approach the world, we approach texts with certain preconceptions, or what Gadamer called prejudgments.
Prejudgment, and sometimes just bias.
Bias, yeah. Vorurteile or prejudgment. This recognition of prejudgments in his argument was critically directed against a certain kind of Enlightenment rationalism, where we are able to completely cleanse ourselves totally of any kind of prior assumptions, as if we were entering the world, you know, like newborn babies, you know, yes, and have no frame of reference with which we approach others. So it against this, what he called the bias against bias, or the prejudgment against prejudgments. He critically responded to a certain kind of Enlightenment universalism, which completely ignores that all of us come from a certain background. We are all rooted somewhere, you know. We are finite beings. We are not free-floating intellects. We are finite beings. We come from a certain background. The task is then how to correct prejudgments or biases if we find them to be untenable, if we find them to be misguided or simply erroneous or false. How can we overcome them? But that's a slow process. We cannot just jump into this universality of reason. We have to work on our prejudgments and slowly, through dialogue, to learn to think better about the other person or about the text that we encounter. So it's this way of proceeding slowly, correcting oneself, listening more and better to the other side and asking new questions, and so slowly to overcome these kinds of limitations, never assuming that we have reached, you know, a total, shall I say, uniformity of beliefs or of existences, because we all come from finite localities and finite backgrounds and finite languages, so that ultimately there will always be a plurality of perceptions. So the question then is, how can we come from our perspective, from our background, from our prejudgments, toward some kind of an agreement with others, or kind of an engagement with others. And on that point, you are quite correct that we have to restrain our impulses to dominate the others, to try to manipulate the other, which is sort of a deep-seated impulse of our ego, the ego, egotism that seems to be deeply rooted, at least in modern Western people. So how to restrain this, and ethics is precisely one of the main ways of limiting, of restraining, of curbing these kinds of impulses. Now, one of these impulses might be to convert the other to my point of view, to my frame of reference, that yours is wrong, mine is the right frame of reference. So I try to convert it. Now, I think that any kind of dialogical position necessarily has to reject conversion. I am thoroughly opposed to any form of conversion. That means missionary activities, all these things. We had too much of that during the last several centuries. Colonialism was basically tied up with missionary activities, to Christianize the heathen, the natives. I mean, the most horrible example of this form of missionary activities happened in Latin America.
The Crusaders.
The Crusaders, and the butchering of the natives in order to Christianize them, to bring Christianity to them by butchering them. So, I mean, these are horrible examples. In many places, this was repeated. So I don't believe actually in conversion. Now, how is that to be reconciled with the request or commandment that Jesus gave to his disciples to spread the good news? He said, "Go into the world and spread the good news." So clearly, what is that? What is the meaning of that? Now, does that mean conversion? Well, I resist that. I think you can spread the good news without converting anybody. You spread the good news by being good to everybody whom you meet. You treat him as an equal, as a human being, with dignity, with respect. That is spreading the good news. I spread the good news not by converting you to become a Christian, but by showing you what it means to act like a Christian should act, namely as a good human being to other human beings. So there's absolutely no conversion necessary or possible in that attitude. So this has to be resisted. So it does not mean that one cannot practice one's religion and practice one's faith, and also if somebody else is interested and ask, what do you believe and what are your rituals? Well, I can tell, and you can say, this is where I come from, this is but always making it clear, I don't want to convert you at all. I spent quite some time in India, for instance, and I had Indian friends, young Indian friends. I went with them to temples, and I worshipped with them at temples. And then they said, well, I want to go with you and go to a Christian church. I said, okay, I will take you on the condition that you realize I'm not trying to convert you. You just look at it, you see what you find there, and then you go with that, And on that basis, we did. We went to a Christian church, a Catholic church, and we had service together. And it was a learning experience for them, just as it was a learning experience for me to go to their temples. But when I went to their temples, they never said, you must be converted to Hinduism. No. So any kind of a truly dialogical relation with another person excludes conversion, excludes the idea. Gandhi, one of my great models, always said, this is wrong, conversion is wrong. It's also not necessary. It's not necessary because ultimately we all believe in the same God or the same divine, whatever we worship, These are just modalities of honoring that great presence or that great being that allows us to be. So there are different ways of doing that. So there's no need to go from one religion to another religion because this is just like changing one melody for another melody. So anyways, I agree with you. There should not be conversion, but there should be actually an openness to the others. Now, I would go a little bit beyond the idea of tolerance or toleration, because to tolerate may be, I really don't like you, but I tolerate you, I mean, I really can't stand you, but I tolerate you. You know, I mean, that's a problem. So one would have to say, well, I go beyond toleration. I really go toward appreciation, you know, toward appreciation.
Recognition, appreciation.
Yeah, that's the Hegelian expression. Recognition and respect, yeah. Yeah, this is also the great poet Goethe said, you know, Toleranz ist nicht genug, Anerkennung ist gefordert. That means toleration is not sufficient, recognition is required. So anyway, this I think is very, very important. And of course, if I recognize somebody else as an equal human being with integrity and with the divine spark in him or her, as I believe all human beings have that divine spark, then clearly I cannot try to convert that person. I cannot try to dominate that person.
Yeah, I think if return to your beginning observation about the relationship between me and the text, and in a way, there's a qualitative difference between the dialogue between two concrete living persons and the relationship between the reader and the text. And if focusing on that, I agree with you, the presumption that you can empty out all of your prejudgment, you use word like a baby, or in a totally neutral, value neutral, disinterested position, and try to arrive at certain kind of objective condition. This is not only unrealizable, may not even be desirable.
It's desirable, no.
Because the question is, some people take a very positivistic view that since the text is in a very blunt way, the text consists of dead letters, and you have to breathe a certain kind of vitality. But my understanding of the dialogical relationship presupposes a kind of prejudgment. So the more I'm critically aware of my prejudgment, even though I can never be fully aware, and the better I would be to assume that I can approach it from a totally neutral point of view, like many of the philologists or textual analysts in the so-called sinological tradition assume. The more you can distance yourself from the text or the values, you can neutralize them, the more you'll be able to understand what objectively that really presents itself. I don't think that works. And this reminds me that Paul Ricoeur's notion of, let's say we use ego as the more negative feature of subjectivism, where self can open itself up to certain kind of text. So we don't simply read about it. We read from it. And the reading itself is a dynamic process of doing, in the sense of trying to not just internalize, trying to embody, trying to develop a kind of embodied knowing or experiential understanding of the meaningfulness or the meaning of the text. And so text is alive and speaks to us in a way that it's not simply imagination. It is something that a text is the embodiment of great spiritual masters or spiritual forces that will enlighten us. And so I think the enlightenment mentality is not only anthropocentric, it assumes that the enlightening process is the process by which the light source is going to overcome all the darkness. In other words, the more knowledge and light source extends, the more this ignorance would be expelled. But I think in the more modern understanding, the more I know, the more I need to know, and the more I don't know. And the spread of certain kind of light to the darkness of the world often has the unintended negative consequence that the veil of ignorance becomes even thicker. So we can never do that. And so we have to recognize that there's more than one interpretation. The plurality of interpretations is taken for granted. And right now, I'm really very much engaged in a kind of group reading and close reading with undergraduates. Reading of some of the very fundamental texts, and not in a way of instructing what is the most accepted approach to the text, but to allow the text to be interpreted by the students who engage themselves in a continuous dialogue and with the text, and by sharing communally some of the insights. There are conflicts and tensions. There are also points of convergence. And so we have plurality, but that does not degenerate into relativism. Yeah. And there's always the continuous encounter between the reader and the text, which is alive and transformative. So the reading itself, and almost like knowing, is a transformative act, rather than knowing is a cognitive reflection of a totally disinterested sort of scientific mind. So that this situation is, as you pointed out, if not diametrically opposed, is significantly different from the Enlightenment mentality. And in the post-Enlightenment, situation in the West, let's say the feminists, the feminist interpretation, the ecological concerns, religious pluralism and cultural diversity, all these, even including deconstruction and the postmodern ideas, are all critical reflections of the limitations, even distortions of the Enlightenment mentality. The irony is that outside of the West haven't yet gone through this kind of critical reflections, still commit themselves to a modernizing process, which is very much the outcome of westernization, modernization, globalization, dictated by the Enlightenment mentality. I think if you look at China today, maybe the most powerful ideology is the kind of scientism as a reflection of the Enlightenment mentality. So whereas the West has already moved beyond Enlightenment and move in a post-modern ethos or mentality, and many people in the developing society, China in particular, are still committed to the modernizing process as progress and so forth. And it is also based upon, say, the Comtean notion that human history progresses from religion to metaphysics to science. So once you get into the science, rationality, then metaphysics and religion can be easily relegated to the background. So this situation both enables me or compels me to develop maybe just a little bit more about this, develop a project. I simply characterize it as a Confucian reflection, both sympathetic understanding and critical analysis of the Enlightenment mentality. It is not how the tradition is able to live up to the standards of the Enlightenment, but to be reflective of what the strengths and limitations of Enlightenment really is. In order to do that, the first step is simply to understand the world of thought of China at a time when there was a contact, maybe 17th, 18th century, between the East and the West. I think in that period, you could say many of the Eastern ideas or Confucian ideas became influential in the beginning of the Enlightenment movement. So people like Voltaire, Leibniz, Rousseau, Montaigne, Diderot, Kenny were all under the influence of this tradition. I think, I'm not sure whether you've met him or not, Nathan Israel. He's now the history professor at Princeton Advanced Institute. His book on Enlightenment Contested indicates very strongly that the West is not only influenced by Confucianism, but became concerned about Hinduism or even Islam. And so it's historically, the claim can be historically or empirically verified that indeed the enlightenment of the modern West, especially the emergence of rationalism and so forth, and at least was inspired, if not totally shaped or influenced by Confucian humanism. And yet, when China and the West, because of the controversy on the Great Right, and no longer was able to communicate to each other, and the situation dramatically changed for maybe for a century or basically a century from 19th century, something very dramatic changed in the West. So the first thing is to understand the Chinese world of ideas and to say what the kind of universe the life of the mind was at the time. Not just Maharishi and his associates, but some Muslim thinkers, philosophers, people in literature, in art, and the richness of that symbolic universe. And then parallel to that is the current, modern, including yourself, the most forward-looking philosophers reflecting upon the Enlightenment as a legacy of modern philosophizing. And the third step is to understand why the Enlightenment mentality, which was under the influence of Confucianism in the earlier period, now became so much rooted in modern Chinese consciousness, to the extent that even though the West already moved beyond it, and the commitment to modernization, to progress, to the kind of, I would say sometimes outmoded positivistic understanding of the Enlightenment continues to persist as a powerful, persuasive, powerful explanatory force in China. Then I think with that background, we can then begin to talk about the, let's say, Confucian humanism in the 21st century. So it's a historical narrative together with the critical social, political, and philosophical analysis of the current situation, why scientism is so powerful in China, and to open the possible space for a genuine Confucian reflection on the Enlightenment.
Yes, I think I fully agree with you on this, the problem of Enlightenment and counter-Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment. I mean, I have experienced similar phenomena in my visits to India. There's also suddenly a tendency to try to catch up with the West, with modernity, modernization, science, and also Enlightenment. And this frequently leads to a total erosion or neglect or amnesia of the great Indian traditions.
Yes.
It's just wiped out because the modern Western Enlightenment superior, is assumed to be superior to all of these. So all of this is wiped out, and in some of the young generation, they go to the West to study, you know. They go to Oxford or Cambridge or to Harvard, and they come home and they totally disdain, have contempt for their own tradition, you know, and only repeat what they have heard in the West, you know, especially from analytical philosophers. And so, I mean, this is a very unfortunate situation, because, as you say, in the West, has been already for some time an effort to move beyond this kind of Enlightenment mentality, which is reflected in sort of an absolute or universal rationalism. So, I mean, the steps have been made. Now, this does not mean that we want to reject Enlightenment, that we want to reject reason or rationalism. The question is just how to interpret them, how to position Enlightenment, and how to reinterpret this, and also reinterpret reason and rationality. And I said many important steps have been made in this direction, and for me, very crucial, a very crucial influence very early on when I become skeptical or somewhat uncertain about the value of Western modernity and Western Enlightenment. Some initial influences for me precisely come from phenomenology and hermeneutics. The idea, you see, of enlightenment, that we can have full enlightenment, that every darkness is excluded, you know, and we are totally rational, that was already overcome by people like Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Gadamer. I mean, the idea that we are basically finite, rooted beings who come from a certain background, that we are not these free-floating intellectuals and absolute universalists, is already overcome by the very idea that Heidegger puts at the very beginning of his major work of Being in Time, when he says, human being, what is that? The Dasein is being in the world. That means we are rooted somewhere, you know. And then this emphasis on human finitude, that we can never totally overcome our finitude. He speaks of our being toward death. Being toward death. So death is not just an accident, but death is what characterizes, what constitutes our human being. We are moving toward death. That constitutes our finitude as human beings. So that's already way beyond the conception of enlightenment, where you can do away with all darkness, with all finitude, with all limitations. That's already a whole new path. So for me, this was a great revelation, this idea of human finitude, of being in the world, of being toward death. Much of it was also in existentialism, to move beyond this enlightenment absolutism. Now, that does not mean emphasizing human finitude and limitations, does not mean that we reject infinity, the infinite. We are finite. That doesn't mean that we celebrate our finitude or our particularism and neglect totally the idea of infinity and of the absolute. The question is how we talk about these things. And that actually leads me back to a discussion we had in our conversation at our conference here in Vienna, where the whole idea of dialogue was first being introduced as a way of dealing with the question of transcendence and immanence. So the relation between finitude and infinity corresponds to the relation between immanence and transcendence. So sometimes people say that Heidegger, existentialists, that they only emphasize finitude. In other words, they emphasize only immanence. There's nothing but immanence, you know. That's frequently a criticism which is made, that they neglect transcendence or infinity. The point which was made in our conference and where this idea of dialogue came up and why it became relevant was that I tried to indicate that these are not binary conceptions, not opposites, finitude and infinity, or immanence and transcendence, but that finitude is precisely a precondition of our striving toward infinity. As finite creatures, we are longing for infinity. In our immanence, we are longing for transcendence. But the two are intimately linked together in a dialogical relationship, if you will, not a dialectical, but a dialogical relationship, or what Panica calls an Advaita, a non-dualist relationship. So this is, you know, an accusation which is frequently made precisely by Enlightenment philosophers. They say, well, all these people like Heidegger and Gadamer and Merleau-Ponty, they only emphasize human finitude and immanence, and they are totally neglectful of universalism. This is a misreading. It's a misreading. What they do, they merely show that every light presupposes a shadow. Every lightness presupposes a darkness. And every rationality presupposes a non-reason. So it's this kind of relationship between immanence and transcendence, or finitude and infinity, that is linked in a dialogical connection. That's what what came out in our discussions at the conference, and this is how this idea of a dialogical relationship was introduced. And I think this is a crucial step beyond Enlightenment rationalism. A crucial step.
I think the question that looms large in my mind is rethinking the human.
Yeah.
This is the kind of abstract universalism, the original state, the generalized self, and the totally disembodied idea of a person without history, without society, not historicized, not contextualized. I think increasingly people are worried about this particular style of philosophizing. Rather, we should consider concrete humanity or the concrete living person as the point of departure. Now, if we take this particular approach, and we can become very parochial, very local. I'm not worried about it. I think the question is the global significance of local knowledge. And realistically, not just in the academic community, but in the intellectual world in general, most of the globally significant local forms of local knowledge came from the West. The local knowledge of Paris, or the local knowledge of London, New York, the modernization theory, the construction, deconstruction, they all came from Europe. And I remember many, many years ago, maybe in the 60s, and I had a conversation with Robert Bellah, and we agree that the next generation, unfortunately, we're already past the next generation, maybe 30 years later, the real global thinkers, or at the time we said world thinkers, we have to recognize at least the willingness to engage the non-Western world. It's not possible to imagine someone could be considered as a world philosopher, but who's deliberately confined himself or herself to the Euro-centered worldview. And in a way, what happened, some very influential and prominent philosophers such as Foucault or Derrida. I don't know, in Merleau-Ponty's case, maybe the same as well. And Habermas. There's very much not only focus on the modern West and somewhat unmindful of the world beyond. In other words, almost like the West is the West and the rest. And if you face the challenge of the West, then the rest will be able to follow the right path or something of that nature. I think this reminds me, Ashish Nandi is a very creative mind from India. He said he never feels comfortable in Cambridge because the close friend who sits beside him seems to assume that your present is our remote past and our present is your distant future. And have this kind of unilinear progression.
It's an insult.
It's it's an insult, but it's assumed by a lot of people. And when Derrida made the remark in China that there's no philosophy, there's no Chinese philosophy, something of that nature. And there's a major debate in China as whether we have Chinese philosophy or simply it is only philosophy in China. We do philosophy in China. That to me is it's very strange. And so we move from that particular Eurocentrism to a much broader horizon of the world. I think you represent this this engagement in India and China. I think Robert Bella, his doctoral thesis on Tokugawa religion. And of course, he became involved with the American scene, the habits of the heart and the good society. But now, his theory of religion is global, following much broader insight. And now he returned to that. I think if his book comes out, it will be marvelous. I think, to a certain extent, Charles Taylor. But in terms of his whole orientation, including the secular age, I wouldn't speak to him directly in that sense. It's very much focused on the experience of the modern West. So most forms of local knowledge that are globally significant originated from the West, but now with a view to the future. And I think increasingly forms of local knowledge in the East will become also globally significant. And the work that I've been involving is one of those examples. What actually happened in the Confucian tradition was rooted in the local knowledge of the Shandong Peninsula in the period of Confucius, and then in China, then in East Asia, and the possibility of moving beyond. So this is a new form, and which certainly will challenge our view about what's going on. So to me, the intriguing thing was that after the First World War, with Spengler's decline of the West, and there was a Institute for Chinese Philosophy in Frankfurt, organized by Otto Franke, and originally the dean, the founder of Sinological Studies in Hamburg. And the people affiliated with that center included Martin Buber, absolutely critical in this, and Carl Jung, maybe some of the younger scholars. I think I'm sure that Heidegger was influenced by Zen Buddhism and Japanese philosophy and so forth. The beginning of the letter on humanism and the more almost even different style of writing toward the end of his life, and also reflected this openness. And yet, after the Second World War, with the rise of America as the superpower, the Marshall Plan on one hand, and the tutelage, in a way, the not colonialism, but the kind of occupation of Japan, or turning Japan into a younger brother, then America transformed herself from a great learning civilization. We learn from the French in terms of the Enlightenment traditions, from Germany, from Germany in terms of science and technology, from England, literature and language and so forth. But since Second World War, America has become a teaching civilization, and sometimes very arrogant. You know?
Yes.
So in this new situation, if we rethink the human with a view to the future, my sense is the viability of the human species looms very large in this discussion. I think in our current, this discussion still unfolding about politics and religion, and there is a transcendent dimension, so transcendence and immanence, but nature seems to drop out of the picture. And yet it is perhaps the primary datum in any reflection on the human. If we want to, say, begin rethinking the human, then Earth looms large in this consciousness. Almost all major religious traditions has been transformed because this new reality or this new awareness. So I think the dialogical mode, rather than, because of the dialectic, always involves violence and overcoming. The dialogical, based upon reciprocal relationships and so forth, may be the only way for the humans, different civilizations, cultures, to cultivate a culture of peace.
Well,
your concluding remark.
It just so happens that the last book that I've written is not yet published, but it will be published this fall, is on nature.
Ah.
It's called Return to Nature, ? And in that book, I develop what I call a counter-history, an ecological counter-history. Counter-history to the narrative which is dominant, the Western narrative of philosophy, Enlightenment philosophy. And I trace a counter-history of people who have been seriously engaged with nature. In other words, instead of the dominant form of dualism that characterizes the modern West, the Cartesian dualism of mind-body, of ego and nature outside to be controlled, they have tried to develop a thought of wholeness, of unity, of cosmos. And I begin there with Spinoza.
Oh, yes, yes.
Crucial now. And then to Leibniz, and from Leibniz to Schelling, from Schelling to the great Romantic period, then to John Dewey, and finally to Heidegger. And concluding chapter makes some references to Asian philosophy, how this comes together. So all of this is an attempt to overcome the binaries or the dualisms that characterize so much of Western civilization, which is basically a unilateral or monological kind of dualism, imposing something on the rest of the world. So nature for me became very crucial as another dialogical partner with whom we have to interact. We have to listen very carefully to nature, what nature tries to tell us. All the violence we do to nature, well, nature responds. So we don't like this violence, and so we have to be very engaged dialogically with nature in order to restore a sense of wholeness.
Yes.
A wholeness which is also wholesomeness in the world, to overcome all these dualisms that pervade modern Western thought, and that, I mean, is precisely the aspect of Western thought which troubles me so much, the persistence of that clinging to this dualistic framework which characterizes modern Western thought, that Cartesian framework, which persists in many contemporary thinkers, including people like Habermas and Richard Rorty in different ways, or Michel Foucault. And so this kind of mentality, try to overcome it in a new direction. And regretfully, I had to conclude that even though in many ways I'm fully in accord with our friend Charles Taylor, I had to conclude, at least in his most recent writings, he was slipping back into these dichotomies which split wholeness apart and make it impossible really to restore unity to the world. And this is especially evident in his
the secular age of the transcendence.
The opposition, the dichotomy between immanence and transcendence, that these are two different realms, you know.
You have to bring the transcendence back to re-enchanting, or to re-saccarize.
Yes, to show the dialogical relationship between immanence and transcendence, that they interact with each other, they respond to each other. Immanence responds to transcendence, and transcendence responds to immanence. And this is why I gave to Charles Taylor a picture of Dürer showing a mother and child and asking him very pointedly, you show me where is the immanence and where is the transcendence? Where does immanence stop and transcendence begin? You cannot do that. You cannot separate it because they are interlinked. They are, you know, inescapably connected with each other and influencing each other, responding to each other in a dialogical way. So that was the main point. But in other ways, of course, I feel that Charles Taylor has made enormous effort to overcome, to some extent, the ethnocentrism or Western centrism or Eurocentrism. He has now spent some time in India, for instance, and so I fully recognize that. But there is still a remnant of that.
I think it's painfully difficult to move from the either-or mode of thinking to both and.
That's the thing, yes.
And, you know, Bei offers a very interesting image. You know, she's a writer about the question of the full moon. Right now, it's only half full, so it's a half moon, and the other side, what do you call it? You know, use our technical language, the politics of absence, and the whole idea of lax. We don't have democracy. We don't have science. We don't have this critical, rationalistic thinking, and so forth. So now the time is ripe for the other side of the moon to reveal itself. So the wholeness you're talking about in terms of human consciousness has to be a fusion, a very healthy fusion of the two, you know, this restorative wholeness. And I think the challenge of the earth may provide the last chance for this particular thinking, even though I'm quite pessimistic, you know, whether it will work or not, given the constraint of institutions, of habits of the heart, of politics and so forth. But the not just the imagined possibility, I think everybody is aware of the fact that without this new integration, without this new sense of wholeness, the possibility of a genuine dialogue, I would call it the emergence of a dialogical civilization. You know, the dialogical dialogue is the possibilities are very limited. And in this sense, maybe presumptuous for me to say in the 21st century, a kind of spiritual humanism will have to emerge as, I wouldn't call it precondition, as the point of departure for philosophical and religious reflections from many different kind of faith communities. In other words, we have to admit we are human first before we are Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, Confucians, and so forth. This reflection on the human from the evolutionary perspective. Say the emergence of the human is such an important cosmic event, and something dramatically changed. We're no longer the outcome of revolution. We now shaped the direction of revolution. And that's, the Confucian idea of partnership or co-creator may be distorted, maybe totally inversed. What is the term for this? Totally upside down.
Oh, yeah.
And inversion.
Inverted,
yeah. To be the major destroyer of not only the human community but nature as well. We definitely now in our possession, definitely the possibility of doing that, and that's the kind of Faustian spirit in terms of the Prometheus spirit and unlimited quest for not just knowledge but also wealth and power and influence at the expense of our own well-being. With this particular situation, I think your cousin's notion that maybe in the 21st century, the prophet is the earth. The earth is going to tell us what is allowable, what is not. And yet the teachers who may help us to move out of this mess may turn out to be indigenous elders with your notion about listening to the voice of the earth and the indigenous traditions, either Hawaiian or here, and seems to have rich resources that the modern person has inadvertently lost. So,
and lost mainly because we have separated ourselves completely from nature.
Yes.
We have become exiled from nature. We have to learn again that we are also nature.
Yeah.
Nature is in us,
yeah.
not just outside of us.
Right.
Not just that we observe, we are part of nature.
There are two very powerful Neo-Confucian thinkers. 11th century, 12th century. Zhang Zai, for example, in his Western inscription, begins with the beautiful line that heaven is my father and earth is my mother, and even such a small creature as I finds intimacy in their midst. So that feels the universe is my body, that directs the universe is my nature. All human beings are my brothers and sisters. All things are my companions. And so forming one body with heaven and earth and a myriad things. And this notion about nature is part of us. It's not an imagined possibility, but it's actually lived reality. We can feel it. Now this, in a way, is quite different from the Heideggerian position, because Heidegger may be the existentialists and assume that we're thrown into this world without aware of it. To exist is to make choice, to authenticate, and what we are. Now, the Finitude, sort of Kierkegaard's notion, sickness unto death, and it's a profound sense of alienation. And maybe because of the scientific technique that has made us totally autistic towards the voice of being. Now, the new humanism, spiritual humanism that emerges, will have to have a very comprehensive or embracing sense of wholeness. And that sense of wholeness is predicated on a form of self-cultivation that help us to move beyond this built-in alienation, sense of alienation. So the finitude, as you pointed out, the infinite the infinite possibility. And one way of saying it, the finitude is such that human beings must recognize the limitation of the human project and the inevitability of moving towards death. But in the Confucian sense, it's the concretization of the human itself. Unlike the Platonic idea, any concretization is a distortion. The Confucian, any concretization or like incarnation is a realization. A realization, the potential and the actual human as not only an observer, appreciator, but also as a partner, as a co-creator. And so how this incredible power of the human, especially as a community, will have to develop a critical sense of, not just humbleness, but critical sense of the proper niche for the human. And so almost like in the 21st century, even a high school student is a global thinker. Whereas in the time of Hegel and others, some of the most brilliant minds fail to understand realistically, the holism of the earth. So my sense is that virtually, all spiritual traditions would be able to, will have to be, all spiritual traditions have rich resources for us to think through this kind of problem. And the Confucian tradition, both the strength and limitations, seems to suggest that without radical transcendence at the time of the axial situation may not have been a lack, but if it is conscious choice, may have been a very significant choice. And so the separation of the immanence and the transcendence and all the other binaries, exclusive dichotomies you pointed out, have been not necessarily overcome, but have been deliberately rejected. And so the new situation then is the possibility for the Confucian tradition to articulate, in this rethinking of the human, to articulate a very basic stratum of being human. And maybe that's the reason why it's possible to talk about a Confucian Christian, a Confucian Jew, a Confucian Muslim, and so forth. I asked myself, first I was involved in a Confucian Christian dialogue in Hong Kong many years ago, and then I realized my partners representing Confucianism, like Julia Chin, Ted DeBerry, John Bertram, and Bob Neville, they're all Christians. So it's not only a Confucian Christian dialogue, it's a Christian dialogue. It took me a while to think, what's the difference between a Confucian Christian and a non-Confucian Christian? My answer now, still tentative, is that if you are a Confucian, you have to be politically concerned, socially engaged, and culturally sensitive or informed. And it's perfectly all right for a Christian to reject politics, to deny the legitimacy of the society as the world of the Caesars, and to consider culture not superfluous for one's faith. That's true with Buddhism and so forth. But as a Confucian Christian, you just cannot afford not to be engaged. So why the power of engaged Buddhism and humanistic Buddhism? And so even though Confucianism is not a religion, the religiousness or the spirituality of the Confucian tradition can be easily shared as part of the human project. So it's maybe presumptuous to make that observation, but I do believe that something rather significant is there.
Yeah, could I just make a brief footnote to this? I would say that a Christian who does not get engaged in the world and with neighbors and helping others and visiting the orphans and the widows, such a person is not a good Christian.
This description of the Christian project is, in a way, a radical departure from the even in the Abrahamic, the myth of Abraham and faith is so important. You know, Kierkegaard would say the night of faith. The absurdity is an indication. The absurdity, of course, from a sociological point of view, can be a test of one's faith.
Yeah. But still, I mean, for a Christian to be totally withdrawn from the world is not a good practice of being a Christian.
Right.
But the other, you know, just a footnote I wanted to make is about Heidegger. The notion that we are geworfen, we are thrown into the world, is precisely a critique of Enlightenment universality.
Yes.
We are thrown in a place,
in a specific place at a time.
A certain time. Right. Our finitude.
So we're fated to be a concrete living person.
Precisely.
Yeah, but that fatedness can be very positive.
Yeah, and it's only in this fatedness, in that finitude, that we can make projects. I mean, the relation here is between two terms which are difficult to be translated: geworfen, Entwurf. We are thrown into a certain finite situation, and in that we have our perspective, we have our aspiration. We make a project, but it's only a thrown project. So it's not an absolute project. So there's always this relationship in Heidegger's work. Now, there is some other element in the later Heidegger which is very close to the Confucian statement that you cited from an 11th century Confucian master, because the Heidegger of his later writings, you know, emphasized the so-called fourfold: the earth, heaven, mortals, immortals. These are the fourfold that Heidegger talks about. Now that's very similar, and not the same, but it's similar to this idea of a wholeness where everything is included, you know, earth with heaven, mortals, finite beings, with immortals, with divinities or divine. So, I mean, Heidegger has a sense of coming closer and closer to an Asian sensibility of the world. And it's not surprising that at one time he even tried to translate the Tao Te Ching.
Yes, he worked with the Xiao Shiyi, you know, this Chinese scholar who actually the only one who accompanied him when he was in a self-imposed exile in the Black Forest in Switzerland. Yes. But I think I would say what Heidegger, you know, the fourfold, from my Confucian point of view, is basically two. That is heaven and earth, the infinite, the finite,
immanent,
and immanent. And my sense of the fourfold is self-community.
Yes.
Self, community, heaven, and earth. So maybe it's better for us to say the self, which is a central relationships rather than isolated individual, is linked to community, but also linked to earth and heaven, and that sense of connectedness is very different. I mean, in a way, much more complicated than the Habermasian idea of fixing the individual, its relationship to society, community. Rorty's thinking, first of all, very either-or. Either you cultivate yourself, realize yourself, or social service. The two are incompatible. And since philosophy is edifying conversation, it's better for us to be realistic. And so we cultivate ourselves even though we will not be able to serve society. I think, so the moral obligation sometimes is relegated to the background. My sense is in the new humanism, in the 21st century, we have to at least take into serious consideration of these four dimensions in a holistic way. You cannot avoid understanding the person, not only in terms of the body, but the mind and heart, the soul and spirit. And also the community, which has to be highly differentiated and yet totally comprehensive. So from the person to the family to community, nature, the world, and beyond. and then earth, nature, and to re-establish the harmonious, sustainable relationship, and heaven. In other words, heaven is no longer that ineffable otherness that we know it has overall power over us, but we can never understand it through rational reasoning. But heaven, because we are partner, is a divinity. I think you follow this line of thinking, divinity in us. So there's immanence of heaven in the person. And the person is not just immanent, because without that reference to the transcendence, the full development of the person is not possible. So the three domains that Kierkegaard makes as very distinctive, as aesthetics, ethics, and religion, in this new vision, that as ethic or morality has to be rooted in the basic human feelings. So aesthetics not at all in conflict with ethics, and ethics is much more than simply the rule-governed behavior. And ethics has to be extended beyond not only society but anthropological world in order to be connected with heaven. So aesthetics, ethics, and religion are a continuum rather than totally separate. This notion about analysis is absolutely critical as a way of training us, the heuristic device. But the reality is a holistic unfolding of human.
I just say that this was a beautiful exercise of a dialogical dialogue we have pursued.
I don't know, maybe it's premature for us to congratulate ourselves, but I do believe, I enjoyed it, I do believe it's a dialogical.
Yes.
Certainly not a confrontation.
No.
I think we can even use Rorty's notion about edifying conversation.
It was more than edifying, it was really educational.
Yes, yes.
So not just edifying that, pleasure.
I agree. I agree. I think that's that's probably a limited notion.
But, well, I mean, this is an example of how somebody like me, coming basically from a Western background, European background, European philosophy, can make contact with somebody coming from a very different background. And although we sometimes use different terminologies, but still we sense the affinities of these different terminologies. We sense an affinity and a similar striving towards something which we, for better or worse, call a wholeness, or a form of cosmos,
or embracing fullness.
Fullness,
using the idea of the full moon.
Yes.
Wow, thanks a lot.
Thank you.